Welcome back, strangers. This happened to one of my friends from college when he was working as a security guard in an old museum not too far from our university. The museum was just outside of the city and was isolated. It was surrounded by woods and not connected to any of the main roads. It was an old colonial house that had been turned into a museum and was mostly just visited by local elementary schools on field trips. One night he was going through his nightly checklist of walking through each room and making sure everything was turned off and locked. As he turned the corner to go into the next room, he saw something move, and one of the lights cut on in the room he had just left. It had freaked him out. He had just shut off all the lights and made sure everything was locked. He went back and cut the lights off and continued his nightly rounds. He kept hearing strange noises coming from inside the old home. He said he thought he would hear whispers and footsteps coming from different rooms. He went through and turned all the lights on and checked the security camera footage, but there was no sign of anyone else being inside. But he was pretty sure he was being robbed or the place was haunted. But he didn't have any evidence that there was an actual burglar, so he didn't call the police or his manager. He had just started the job and he didn't want to seem paranoid. The next morning he told the opening staff what happened, and they laughed it off and said it was probably just their ghosts playing tricks again. He tried to rationalize the whole thing as maybe the storm the night before had caused electrical problems. He's not sure exactly what happened that night, but it was the first of many things he couldn't quite explain that happened while he worked there. Strangers, would you work as the night security guard at an old colonial museum? Let us know in the comments below. Welcome back, strangers. Whenever you move into a new place, it can be a little strange at first. As you get settled in and get used to the new environment, you slowly learn all the weird noises and quirks that the place has until it eventually becomes your home. Have you ever thought that someone else was coming into your home, or maybe there was someone else hiding inside? A woman was living alone in a small house. She started hearing and noticing odd things. Food went missing and there was extra dirty dishes and damp towels in her hamper that she didn't use. She thought she was going crazy until one day she knew for certain she heard noises coming from inside the attic. She went up to investigate and found someone had made a bed up there and brought in a radio, a sleeping bag, and even a microwave. Some stranger was living like an attic king, rent-free in her own home. She called the police and they began watching the house. Eventually they caught a homeless man climbing up the side of her home and entering through a tiny window. They arrested him, but he was just a guy who was down on his luck. He was nice and understanding, and the woman didn't even press charges. She even helped him find a place until he could get back on his feet. Strangers, what would you do if you found a man living in your attic? When I was 21, I worked at a grocery store with a guy named Brian. He was a normal guy, mid-20s. I really didn't think much of him at the time. One day we're working together and he tells me how he lives in an apartment by himself and his neighbors are absolutely crazy. Like they would yell at him to be quiet, pound against the wall, tell him to shut up, even though he wasn't doing anything except sitting there quiet in his apartment alone. Sometimes he would sneeze and his neighbors would scream at the top of their lungs and freak out on him. It was really bad. When he was telling me this, I didn't think much of it. I was just trying to pass the time at work, hoping until I could get home and relax, because I just didn't want to work. I had school, I had a lot on my mind. Well, a couple days go by, and I noticed that Brian's not showing up anymore. Whatever, I didn't think much of it at the time. Well, then a month or two goes by, and he finally shows back up at work. So I'm nice and friendly, I ask him where he's been. He tells me he was actually fired and had to be rehired because he was in the hospital for so long. I didn't think that was a valid reason to fire someone, but what do I know about employee law? I asked him why he had been in the hospital for so long, and he told me it was for personal reasons. I told him it was good to have him back, and I just carried on my day. Again, just wanting to get home, go to bed, go to school and work the next day. Fast forward a couple days later, I'm talking to a different coworker who was really good friends with Brian, and they ask me, "Did you hear what happened to Brian?" I tell them, yeah, he was in the hospital and was fired or something. And they ask, "Do you know why he was in the hospital?" And I told him no, he said it was personal, I didn't think much of it at the time. So my coworker then told me what actually happened to Brian, causing him to disappear for a couple months. He was again at home by himself when his neighbors start yelling at him out of nowhere through the walls for being too loud. Well, Brian tells himself he's had enough and he just freaks out. He decides to call the police and have them deal with it. The police arrive and start talking to the neighbors for quite some time. Hours go by with the police talking to the neighbors. So he calls the police again, just paranoid and anxious about what's taking so long. The dispatcher responds that the police left the scene an hour ago. Well, it turns out that the neighbors were never yelling at him. In fact, they were never there. Brian's schizophrenic and was just hearing voices in his head the whole time. So he was taken to a mental hospital to be evaluated and put on the correct medication, and make sure he was functioning enough to return to living by himself and hold a job. When I was about 7 years old, my father bought a few hundred acres in South Mississippi, about an hour and a half from West Mobile, Alabama. He built a small cabin on top of a hill that was in the middle of a large field, surrounded by woods. This house was about 5 miles from a paved road. To get to our land, it took nearly 10 minutes of driving down dirt roads from the main highway, which was south of the house. About a quarter mile north from the house, he built a small lake, more like a pond. It was about as long as a football field, but wider. To get to the lake from the house, you had to take Route A, which was a hard-packed dirt road that was lined with dogwood trees. It was beautiful in the spring. Route B was about 100 yards east of the dogwood lane, and we named it Vampire Trail because it was always so gloomy. The trees blocked out the sun on the brightest days, and it had a slight decline as you walked towards the lake. I say walked because the trail was not meant for vehicles. Thick woods filled the area outside between both trails. One morning during the fall, my parents and my sister had gone to get ice cream and do some shopping. This trip would take them at least an hour or two. I was 10 years old, so I decided to go fishing while listening to Bama play Ole Miss. The game was the usual Bama win, so I thought I could ease the boredom of a blowout by fishing in the well-stocked lake. So I carried my pole, small radio, and my ice chest down. I had a terrier named Bully that never left my side, and was on this day I realized how awesome he really was. Onto the lake we went. Picture a large oval, roughly the size of a football field, but larger, with an L-shaped pier on the southeast corner. Vampire Lane opened up to a more severe decline to the shore and then the small pier. Across the lake on the west side was a narrow tree line that separated the shore from Dogwood Lane. On the north side of the lake was the dam, and the south ended in a thick and swampy woods. Fortunately for me, I realized this later. About 5 minutes after I threw out my line, and 2 Bama touchdowns later, I got a weird feeling. It's a feeling that I've come to recognize well, and it may have saved my life that day. The feeling of being watched by something dangerous. My dog Bully must have felt it too, because a few seconds later I could hear him growling low and staring across the lake to the west, to the tree line that separated Dogwood Lane from the lake. I turned my head to that direction, and almost immediately my eyes lit on what I thought to be half a silhouette of a large man behind a tree. It was too far to make out the details, but close enough to be sure of what I was seeing. Almost 5 minutes went by, and right before I scolded myself for an overactive imagination, half of the silhouette moved behind a tree slowly. Bully stood and growled louder. I then told him quietly to stop, and I turned my head north towards the dam while keeping my eyes and attention rooted on the tree. Over the next 10 minutes, which felt like hours, I watched while the figure slowly moved from tree to tree, always north and always facing me. The saying "scared stiff" was something I found to be true. For some reason, I thought it was important that whoever or whatever it was did not know I was aware. I finally realized that the figure's path was bringing it closer to the dam, which would make its path shorter and easier. My paralysis broke, and I casually put down the fishing pole and started walking towards Vampire Lane. As an adult, I was in the army for 11 years as a MP, but not turning to look over my shoulder during that walk was the hardest thing I've ever done. In my mind's eye, whatever it was screaming across the dam towards me. When I hit the tree line, I broke into a run. As I was running, Bully dashed ahead of me, and my anger turned into admiration as he stopped and faced north until I passed him. He continued this action my entire run home. My dog was literally watching my back. It was epic. Although I can grasp how awesome this is now, at the time I was so scared that I was literally sick. Even at such a young age, I knew that a large man watching and trying to creep on a 10-year-old was certainly up to no good. When I reached the cabin, I immediately locked the door and got my dad's shotgun as well as his .38 revolver. I sat at the large front windows, my eyes glued to both trail openings and the woods between them. My family returned shortly, and for some reason, I didn't even mention what happened. I never felt safe there again. When my friends or my little sister wanted to go anywhere other than the area around the cabin, I made sure my parents were with us. What scares me the most is that our closest neighbors were about 2 miles northwest of us, between thick woods. Who or what the hell was watching me that day in the woods? I guess I may never know. I sometimes wish I could go back there as a grown man with military training as I am now. My dog Bully lived a full life and was put to sleep peacefully at a very old age. But man, what a great dog. The best dog I've ever known. My dad sold the land a few years after the incident and bought a beach house in a beautiful Gulf Coast town, which I was definitely happy about. Welcome back, strangers. This story is about my grandpa. After high school, he worked at a filling station on the side of the highway back in the 70s. The gas station was open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and at the time, my grandpa was the only one working the night shift. It was usually from 11 p.m. to 7 in the morning. One night a guy comes in, and he just is super creepy and freaking my grandpa out. He seems sketchy, he's wearing a tight jacket and pants, and you could tell there was something in his pants under the jacket. It was during the summer, and it was so warm in the area, it was really strange that he was wearing a jacket to begin with. A lot of truckers came through since it was the only station open 24 hours a day for a long stretch of highway. The station also had a big lot where the truckers could park and sleep and take a break if they needed to. On this night, at this time, it was just my grandpa, the sketchy dude, and there happened to be one other trucker that my grandpa kinda knew and had talked to enough that he felt comfortable asking him to stay and hang out until the sketchy stranger left. Well, after looking at the stocked shelves for several minutes and sneaking peeks at my grandpa behind the counter, the stranger eventually looked fed up and got in his blue car and sped off. The cool trucker guy hung out with my grandpa a little longer until another couple guys came in to use the booth and eat a sandwich. I should also point out this was pretty much in the middle of nowhere in the rural southeast United States in the 1970s. The only way to communicate was CB radio and a landline, and the store only had a landline. After a few hours had passed, my grandpa had shaken off all the paranoia and hadn't really thought of the strange man in a while. All of a sudden, this truck driver comes hauling ass into the parking lot. He jumps out, runs into the store, hollering he needs to use a phone. The guy immediately calls 911 to report that he walked into a gas station 40 miles back, the next closest station, to find that an attendant had been shot and killed. No one else was around, and the only other piece of information is that a blue car was seen speeding out of the lot when the trucker pulled in. Apparently, they eventually apprehended the guy in the blue car, and my grandpa confirmed that it was the sketchy dude from earlier in the night, and they charged him with murder and armed robbery. So thankfully for that one trucker who stayed with my grandpa, make sure he wasn't the one who was murdered that night. Stay strange.